my work community, my school community, my children's sports community. We have lots of different types of community. And so when we really start thinking about supporting an individual with a disability, I always like people to think about it. We're truly trying to understand, how are we supporting them within their own communities, within their own family and friend networks. If you'll see in the middle of the circles, I like to use this circle to really help us, think about traditional types of services over the last 100 years. And if you think about it, we have a person with a disability, and we've wrapped them around services. And we've done this because we have really thought about, how do we support their educational needs? How do we support their transportation needs? How do we support their medical needs, their residential needs? And we've thought of all of these wonderful ways that we've traditionally thought about supporting people. But what I like to tell people is if you see that circle wrapped around that person, what we've unintentionally done by really thinking about every single need, the way that we've built our entire service systems, is it's that those services themselves that have actually become the barrier to connecting with our family and friend, and to being a part of the communities that we want to be a part of. So unintentionally, those services themselves have segregated people with disabilities. I always use the example of special education. Special education was always designed to be a support so you could go to school with your peers. In reality, what special education has done is created a segregated sort of a different path and a bit different trajectory for people. So as I sit here and I tell you this, I will tell you, I have a brother that requires 24-hour supports. And so, I'm telling you this because I'm not saying that services should go away. So some people say, well, why do you talk about services that way? But why I tell you that is it challenges the way we think about services. And if we're going to think about services in a very different way, as we really think about people to have a great life, we need to think more like the visual on the right-hand side. And what you'll see inside the visual on the right-hand side is we need to take every person and everything they bring to the table, their strengths, their preferences. We need to bring their family and their friends and really understand that network. We need to look at what the roles they have in the community and the community they're a part of. And we need to think about the integrated supports to support not only the individual, but maybe the family member or the community to help support that individual. So what you see on that star is there's 5 types of supports that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But hopefully what you see on that star too is that the green that was wrapped around that center circle is in that star as well. So it's about, how do we take those services and supports that your state or local community has to offer, and how do we integrate those together to really ensure that those services themselves isn't becoming the thing that's the barrier to the great life that we're looking for. I shared this map with you because about 10 years ago, we started the National Community of Practice, and Connecticut was one of our first states. And so the LifeCourse framework wasn't even around when we started that community of practice. And ever since then, the framework has evolved to, we've been learning more, people have been thinking about different ways to use it, and it's been growing across the country. So a lot of different state service systems, a lot of educational systems, a lot of voc rehab systems. We're starting to work now with aging and the foster care system, are using this framework to really guide the way that they're moving forward in terms of their policies and their practices. So when we get together and we start thinking about the framework, we're not going to do it tonight, but I oftentimes use this framework to really challenge our policymakers and our state service system leaders to tell them, we can't just retool the system. If we want something different for our individuals that we support, our family members, or ourselves with disabilities, we can't just keep changing the names of things and doing little tiny tweaks. But we need to fundamentally think differently about how we support people and how we really create this sort of system where the person is directing not only their plans, but they're directing their services, and they have control over their funding, and they have control over their life. So ultimately what the framework does is it brings together many of the sort of principles and keywords and practices that are thrown around in our field all the time: the family-centered, community integration, self-determination. and brings them together in a user-friendly format to help you really understand all of those things. So the Charting the LifeCourse framework was developed by individuals just like you, and actually Connecticut was part of it. Some of you on this call might have been part of the original group, and it started out really as our core value statements, and we started to articulate those core value statements and talk about them and share them, and they ever since have evolved into specific sets of tools to really help us think differently. I always tell everybody is that not only can this help an individual and their family, but I can use this exact same framework when I'm sitting down with a legislator or a policymaker or the director of a department and tell them that this framework can help them explore different possibilities. It can help them increase their expectations. It can help them problem solve and plan. And that's part of the reason why I think so many people gravitate to this framework, because it has so much utility and can be used in so many different ways. What you'll see at the end is it not only is a framework, but it's become an icon and a language. You probably maybe don't even realize it now in Connecticut, but there was a day in Connecticut we didn't talk about good lives and trajectories and the integrated support stars. And so the language itself has become a way to articulate things. So let's get started on that. So what is the core belief for us is that all people and their families have the right to live, love, learn, work, play, and pursue their life aspirations in their community. And I think it's really important for me to always start here. And I like to point out a couple different things for people when I start here is that it doesn't say all people with disabilities. It very intentionally says all people. Because when we set out to create this framework, we wanted it to be something for all people. And if we created a different framework for people with disabilities, we were continuing the cycle of creating a different bar, a different expectation for people with disabilities. The other thing that you'll see on here is the word rights. And I tell everyone that comes and listens and is a part of the disability field in some way that really what we're a part of is a disability rights movement. We're really a part of figuring out services and supports so that every individual in the United States has the ability to access their full rights to live, love, learn, work, and play. And so it's a different way to think about how we're delivering services and thinking about services, or even think about when I'm thinking about my little brother, that everything that I'm doing to try to figure out how to support him is not only a support to his day-to-day supports, but it's really supporting his rights as an individual. The first key principle is focusing on all people. And I like to bring this concept up, even though I'm going to get straight into all the practical tools that you're here to learn and talk about, because I think that there is a misconception in our country that just because I have a disability label or my family member has a disability label or my neighbor has a disability label, that they automatically receive services. And I think it's really important for people to realize that when we start talking about services, there's a number of different types of services, but predominantly when we're talking about long-term services for people with developmental disabilities, it's typically through their Medicaid offices or their state agencies that are utilizing Medicaid funding. We know at the federal level that only 1 out of 4 people with the developmental disabilities are actually known or receiving services from their state DD agencies. So this tells us there's a lot of people out there that 1, don't know about services, or 2, maybe they don't want services that the way they're being offered. And so it requires us to really understand what I say is the all. This framework is not just something for someone in paid services, it's rather a framework for thinking about it, whether you're in services or not. So the second principle is really looking at that person within the context of their family. So as you sit here and you're listening to me, and as I start talking about the slide on the screen, you can be thinking about yourself, and you can also be thinking about your family unit, or maybe you're thinking about an individual with a disability and their family unit. But every one of us has our own likes and dislikes. We all have different skills and abilities. We all come from maybe different races and different sexual orientations. These are all things that make up who we are. We also have a social network, right? We have our own family and friends. My parents have their own family and friends. Some of them might be same, some of them might be different. I also tell people you also have reputations as a family in your community. So there's a lot of things about who you are and who that person with a disability is. And some of them are sometimes connected. Um, I always tell people that just because my mom and dad might like a certain food doesn't mean I like a certain food. And so when we sit down and we're really trying to understand an individual and who they are to provide the supports that they want, do we truly know them as an individual, but do we also understand the context of the family that they exist in? We also can look at the environment. You know, where does the family or the individual live? I always like to use the example of when I talk to voc rehab counselors, and maybe they go talk to somebody that has grown up on a farm. You can't make the assumption that somebody wants to grow up being a farmer just because their family did. So don't assume that that's what they want to do, because they might want to do exactly the opposite of what their family wants to do, or maybe they do want to follow in those footsteps. So our environment can tell us a lot about an individual. The environment the family grew up in can tell us a lot about the individual. I always tell people that with my little brother, who has been labeled with having extreme behaviors at times, you know, if you understood the way our family's patterns and our rules and our expectations, you'd probably understand certain things about my little brother better. I remember he used to have a number of different sort of expressions of behavior in the car, because people would get in the car, they'd be in a big hurry, and they'd start the car and not everybody had their seatbelts on. Well, we have taught Eric from a very, very young age, put your seatbelt on. So the second somebody didn't have their seatbelt on, it really caused a bunch of anxiety with Eric in the car. And oftentimes he communicated by whacking somebody or throwing something in the car. And so when we start thinking about an individual, we have to think of the context of their family, their environments, the expectations, the dreams, the rules, and the relationships in their life. I also think it's really important for people to really understand, where do people with disabilities live? And I think it's important for people who have younger children. I think it's important for people who have transition age children, and even important for people who are adults and aging to understand this. This is a national statistic. We could do it exactly for Connecticut, and I apologize, I don't have that. But what we know nationally is, if we know there's 75% of people not known to the federal service system, we do know a little bit about the other people who are actually getting services. And I think that there's this sort of, again, urban myth across our country that when my child turns 18, they're going to move out and move somewhere. Before, it used to be move out and move into a group home or some sort of institutional based settings. And that has changed. If you look at the number, what you see is that, you know, more than half of the people known to the service system are receiving some form of services in their own home, or in the home of their family member or somebody that they know. And only 11% of those individuals are actually receiving those with a service provider in another setting. Somebody asked the question about 12% include children. This is a lifespan approach. So this is a high number. It does have a small percentage of children in there. But when you start looking at their triangle by themselves, that number falls really, really low in terms of living out of the family home. The other thing I always really, really press people to think about when they're planning or exploring or thinking about now or thinking about the future is we all have different life stages. And so this is one person's life stage, right? You're born, you go through these different life stages as you start getting older. And if you think about it, you're very dependent as a baby on adults in your life who are typically your family or somebody who is your caregiver. And that at the same time, that family has its own life cycle. And so as that individual is aging and comes into adulthood, they might want to start their own family. Or maybe that family, they themselves are aging. I talked to a number of families who are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and they're talking about their adult children. And so when we start planning with an individual that family is in that life stage, that's a very, very different, a very different conversation than if I'm having a conversation with somebody who is it's transition age, living at home with their family, and really understanding that family's life cycle. So we like to always kind of take those two conversations in mind when we're thinking about the individual's life. The other thing is and this is probably the other slide that I tell people I could spend an entire day on. But this slide really came about because a number of individuals, there's a family group in the St. Louis area that asked me to come talk to them. And everybody in that group, I would say the average age of that group of individuals was 90 years old. So they all had a loved one with a disability. And what they said to me is they said, Shel, okay, we think we need to start planning about the future. We think it's about time. And we think that we've figured out their finances. We figured out what provider that they're going to use. We figured out where they're going to live. And they felt like, you know, they kind of had those things in place. And what I did was I got this slide out and I said, okay, so you've really thought about all the things around, you know, caring for somebody, their day-to-day needs. You've thought about special needs trust. You've thought about their Medicaid services. You've thought about where they're going to live. But what I challenged them to really think about was who in their lives are their friends, who knows them well, who knows what makes them tick, who knows what makes them happy, who knows how they like to celebrate their birthday, or what makes them happy at Christmas time or whatever holidays they like to support. And the room got quiet. And they said, I don't know. And so what we challenged them to do was to really start thinking about that. Because what I said to them is, if something happens to you, and of course you've figured out your finances and the housing and all those are all things that we can help with. However, what we can't help with is understanding the lived experiences and the things that really made your child happy and the people in their lives. So how can we help you start thinking about that? So one of the tools that we have is actually a tool that you can get off our website that can help you begin thinking about that. You know, who loves and cares about my child, or who loves and cares about me? There's one for someone to fill out for themselves. Who has the knowledge about this person with a disability, or the person you're planning for? It doesn't always have to be the person with a disability. I've had some families say, well, we were planning it for dad because dad got cancer, and we use these tools to think about our family unit that way. But I have a twin brother, and it's funny, when I get this tool out, I start talking about it. My twin brother always says to me, when do I just get to be Eric's brother? Why do I have to be someone that has to be his caregiver, or know about the service system, or know about the supports and stuff? So what it does for us as a family is think about the different roles that people play in the different people's lives, and how do we nurture those? How do we start filling those? I always challenge people. I'm like, no matter what age you are, start filling this out, and know that it changes, it evolves, right? I'm not best friends with my friends, you know, from third grade. I have new best friends. I might stay in touch with them, but I have a different relationship with them. You know, I'm married now, so my day-to-day supports comes from my family, my immediate family, and not my mom and dad anymore. It's a constantly evolving people coming into your life. But what I tell people when you're planning with a person with a disability, who's in their life is so, so important. And so how are we actually spending time intentionally thinking about mapping and planning for the people in somebody's life, so that you don't get to be 90 years old and go, I only have myself listed there for my child. He doesn't have a lot of friends. I don't know who is going to actually help us think through some of these things. Of course, as a sibling, I have to point this out. The siblings are often what we would call the club sandwich generation. This comes from the National Sibling Leadership Network, which is a national network for people, siblings of individuals with disabilities. And I think it's really important to think about as we're growing up as siblings to one another with and without disabilities, that we have each other in our lives. And one of the things my parents have always said to me is how do I support each of my children to have a successful adult life? And they often worry that if something happens to them, what impact is that going to have on me as a sibling? What impact does that have on my other siblings? And how can we really kind of plan for the future together? I always tell people, especially if you have aging parents, those are my parents. If something happens to them, I'm going to be grieving my loss of my parents at the same time, stepping into the role of really understanding how to maintain my little brother's supports. At the same time, I'm raising my own family and my own children. So how are we really thinking about every member of the family and how they're a part of the long-term and short-term planning? So the trajectory is the principle 3, and the trajectory thinking across life experiences. And for me, the trajectory, I really love this quote because the future is not something we enter, it's something we create. It requires us to make choices and decisions, and it's something that begins with a dream. So when you start thinking about that and you start kind of thinking of vision for your good life, I usually have people start talking about what is your good life? If I could ask you what defines your good life, everybody would say a different answer. It would talk about some people might talk about their pets, others people might talk about being healthy, other people might talk about going on vacation. So every one of us has a very different vision for a good life, and our visions evolve, right? So if I'm talking to someone who's had a job for a long time, their vision is to retire. If I'm talking to a college student, their vision is to get a job. And so what is it that really is what I tell people, their Northern Star? What is it that we're really striving for? But just as important as someone's vision for their good life is, it's really understanding also what is it they don't want in their life. So this is Ben's vision. His vision is to be around his family and friends, have a girlfriend, be able to go to WWE and concerts and NASCAR races. He wants to get another tattoo. You see in this picture, he's getting his first tattoo, which his mom never thought he would get. He loves Pepsi. He loves drinking beer. He loves the fire station. He loves going to church. These are things, that's his vision for maintaining his good life. But when we sat down and started talking to him and his family, there's things that we know that he doesn't want. He doesn't want to live in poverty. He knows that he has a high chance of getting heart disease or diabetes. So as much as he loves his Pepsi, we also have to help him maintain a good amount of Pepsi so it doesn't impact that. He doesn't like to be segregated or isolated. He knows he does not want to live in an institution or a group home, and he doesn't like to be treated differently. And so when we sit and have this conversation, we start almost every conversation this way, whether I'm doing a 2-hour planning meeting with somebody or a 10-minute planning meeting with somebody. If I don't have a picture of somebody's Northern Star, it's really hard to plan and problem solve with them. But what I often find is when I have this conversation with usually the parents or families, they put a big question mark in that blue vision. They don't really have a concrete vision. They'll say something like, well, I want them to be happy. I hope they have a job of some sort. And so they kind of throw those sort of general kind of thoughts out there. But when I ask those same families the question of what don't you want for their child, that bubble gets really, really big. They can start defining for me, I want them to live here. I don't want them to live here. I hope they have this kind of job. I hope they have this kind of money and that kind of stuff. And so the whole concept of sometimes using what I don't want to actually help you think through what you do want is a really, really great way to start. I also know when I'm working with a family, if they don't know what they want for their vision, but they know what they don't want, I tell them that's okay. That's our job, to keep problem solving and seeing what's possible, and looking at what types of experiences and opportunities might be available. The other thing you're going to see on this slide is you see that black arrow. That's what I call our trajectory arrow. And the word trajectory, for people if that's new, is the direction something headed. So if you throw a ball, it's headed in a certain direction. So if you think about the things that happen in your life, we want our trajectory to go towards what we want. We don't want our trajectory to lean towards the things that we don't want. So when we start talking about services and supports, what I often tell people is, you see that solid blue line on this slide? Services and supports are that blue line. Services and supports should be designed to push your trajectory and to push you to have the life that you want. Services and support should never actually become your line. They should never become the thing that takes you the direction of what you want or what you don't want. So when we start thinking about services and supports that way, of something to keep us on the path of what we want to do, we have to know what it is that we want to do. If you think about it, traditionally in the field of disabilities, we talk in terms of these sort of life stages, and you get a diagnosis. Maybe you got it when you're younger, maybe you get it when you're older, and people talk about early childhood, then you go to college or high school, and then people start talking about transition planning, and are you leaving when you're 18 or you're 21? And so there's some very set life transitions, many of them set by your federal government or your state agency. And so I know when we would sit down to plan with people throughout Eric's life, they oftentimes would talk to us about those transition points. So Eric's getting ready to turn 18. Are you going to get guardianship? Are you going to do SSDI? Are you going to get, Social Security? And all of these different things are starting to be asked of us as families and individuals with disabilities, based on different policies and practices. What I don't ever remember anyone doing in all of the years of Eric growing up through high school and as a youth and as a young adult, was anybody ever coming into our home and talking to us about life experiences. Talking to us about, does he have chores around the house? Does he know how to say no? Does he has he made mistakes, and can he learn from those? Is he doing things with friends and families? Does he have hobbies? And I challenge people, both as professionals on this call and as families, as how can we really think about planning through the lens of life experiences? Through really thinking about, what are the things that I want my child to experience, as opposed to always saying, what are the services that I need next? But rather, what do I want to experience, and what are the services that will help me experience those things? So one of the main things around the LifeCourse framework is this big focus around life experiences and conversations around that. So we have some different tools and some different things for you to begin thinking about life experiences organized by age. So if we were doing this in person, I would ask you this at your tables and have a small conversation about it, but obviously we're doing it by Zoom. And so I will kind of walk you through this thing. But even if it's really, really hard for you to think about what you were doing when you were 13 exactly, that's about 7th and 8th grade, right? You could think back and you can think about those youth and experiences that you had. And somewhere around that age, you were probably starting to branch off and try new things. Maybe you were staying out a little bit later than you should. Maybe you were, tempting and trying, a cigarette, or you trying to, kiss a boy or a girl, or you were, helping the neighbors out and shoveling the lawn or shoveling the snow, or, you were doing things that were recreational based or faith based. And so you're doing kind of all of these things as a 13-year-old. I always tell people to kind of think about that age for a second, because when we were younger, we had the opportunity to make a lot of silly, stupid mistakes that you often made and you hopefully learned from. Some of them you made a mistake and decided that, even though I know that was wrong, I'm going to do it anyway. So there's a lot of things that happen in our life experiences. I often tell people, I'm like, think back about your first job. So maybe you got it when you were 15, or maybe you got it when you were 21, or maybe you started helping out a lot around the house when you were at a very young age. Are you still doing that now? Or has your career evolved and the different things you've done evolved? So life experiences are constant. They're always evolving and changing. But one of the things that I really like to think about, though, is that there were things that were happening to us throughout our entire lives that helped us understand how to stay safe, how to say no, how to protect ourselves. And we think about, even my little brother, and I think back around his youth, and there was always somebody there to prevent anything to happen to him. And what we accidentally started to do to Eric was really sort of put we wrapped him around this sort of adults and safety, and didn't want any harm to happen to him, that he oftentimes didn't learn natural consequences. He didn't learn how to make informed choices. And in some ways, that ultimately can hurt him because he never learned how to say no or yes, or to really kind of understand how to keep himself safe. We also start thinking about, if we're wanting somebody as an adult to have a job, what are the experiences that they need to have at a very young age? So I tell people to think backwards. If you're planning with a 24-year-old, or you're thinking about adulthood, and you're saying to yourself, well, I really hope that they have a job in the community, and I really hope that they live in an apartment, maybe with a roommate. Think all the way back to when you were an infant. There were things that you were doing at the age of 5 that were your stepping stones to thinking about your career. You're learning about how to play and socialize. Maybe even when you were younger, people started to ask you, well, what are you going to be when you grow up? Are you going to go to college? Are you going to go to trade school? What are you doing to volunteer? Are you learning about money through chores? Those life experiences are different stepping stones. It wasn't until Eric was in his 20s, probably early 20s, that we started to realize, wow, there were a lot of life experiences Eric didn't have. But that didn't stop us from teaching him now to start having those life experiences. How could we start introducing Eric to doing more things around the house, starting to learn the value of money? And so we all have, no matter what age we are, can really start these different life experiences. So when you start thinking about life experiences, I do know as a family member, it's very scary because life experiences come with risk. They could get hurt. Somebody can take advantage of them. There's all of these things and factors that we start to really worry about. And what I really challenge everybody to do, though, is the more and more and more that we put protection and we wrap somebody around this sort of overprotection, the more we're actually harming them, because they're not learning about any of the ways to make their own choices and to experience the things that are important to them. So we have to constantly be balancing dignity of risk and self-determination with health and safety. And it is really, really hard to do in this big, scary world that we live in, but it's really, really important for us to do. The other thing that I always tell people is that you should never be defined by the things that have happened to you in your past. And I use the example with my little brother often, that when he was like 10 years old, he was playing around with matches. We left him alone for 5 minutes, and he got scared. He lit a match and threw it into the closet, and all of the covers lit on fire. And so he started a little fire. And I remember my mom, when Eric was about 16, 17 years old, she saw a file that one of the case managers had. And on the front of the file, it had red flags, and it said, he's a fire starter. And so what my mom always said to me, I remember her saying, why does things that people with disabilities do have to be life sentences? Like, when does it fall off their charts that those aren't things that they do all the time, that those were experiences that they were having that many other people experience, but it doesn't get written down in a chart and follow them for their entire lives. So I challenge us to think about the things that we're worried about. Are those things still current? Are the things written about either yourself or your child or the person with the disability? Are those current risk, or are those things that continue to follow that individual? But I also want to talk from a very positive standpoint of when we start thinking about a vision, it changes our expectations. If I have a vision that my child is going to be employed, then I start setting those expectations, and that means their experiences are going to be adjusted that way. Ben's mom always shares the example of, Ben couldn't do the same things around the house that his twin brother and his older brother can do, but he always had a chore. And she always adapted that chore to something he could do so that he had the expectation that when you're done with dinner, the family helped around the house to clean up the kitchen. He loved water. He loved to stand at the sink with her while she was washing the dishes. And so he could help rinse the dishes off. And so that became the expectation. That became the experiences that they started to set. Those experiences then, when he got into high school and started to do things, he started to have opportunities to learn how to do other things that he likes to do. And I always tell people, you increase experiences and you increase opportunities, you're going to have more possibilities. And the more possibilities you have, it's going to impact your vision. It's going to change your vision. So how do I apply all of this practically? So this is a vision, this is what we call our life trajectory tool. And we sat down with Ben and his family, and we sat down and we started on the right-hand side of that tool. And we said, let's describe exactly what a vision for a good life for Ben would be. Let's help us understand what it looks like for a good life and what it is that we don't want. And then we went all the way over to the left side of that form, and we started to say, what are some of Ben's past life experiences that were positive? And what were some of the things that Ben does not want to experience anymore? And so we started to write those down, chores and family vacations, riding his bike, learning how to use his own debit card, volunteering as a football manager, and volunteering at the fire station. These are things that were really important to Ben. But he also had a past he didn't want to re-experience. He didn't like special education. He felt very different and very isolated. People had very low expectations for him for his future. Mom and Dad look back now and realize that always demanding that a paraprofessional was by his side actually was to his detriment. He didn't have a lot of friends because there was always an adult by him. He always leaned on that adult to help him do things and not figure out things on their own. So they wish they'd looked back at that paraprofessional to see different ways they could support him, but help him become more independent. So now that we kind of understood his past and we kind of have that flash there, I could either do that past of his entire life, or if I was doing this for just thinking about the last year, I could talk about the positive experiences from our last year and the experiences that are negative experiences from the last year. So then we start looking at the middle, and I started to ask them, so tell me what you want to happen right now. And they want him to continue volunteering. They want him to work out. He wants to continue hanging out with friends. They want to possibly explore a micro enterprise or starting his own business. And I asked them, what are some of your risks? What are the things that you're worried about? And that's what they wrote on this bottom line. They didn't want him just sitting around the house all day. They didn't want him gaining weight and drinking too much Pepsi. And they were also really scared that he was going to become reliant only on paid services and not have natural supports in his life. This gives them and us a really, really great snapshot of exactly how to problem solve and plan and support Ben. Ben does this prior to going to a planning meeting. He can take that into the planning meeting. He can use that to help have this formal conversation during his person-centered formal planning meeting. We have students who do this and take it to their IEP meetings, and they use it in the school setting. Ben also uses this to train staff. So if he has a new direct support staff come into his life, he gets this trajectory out and he shares that trajectory with them. So it's a very concrete snapshot that really can help people really understand who Ben is. I just wanted to quickly throw this in here too, because the trajectory concept can be used for all types of problem solving. So when COVID first happened, Ben and his family sat down and they got a trajectory out. And they said, how are we going to cope with COVID? How are we going to cope with being socially isolated in our home? And so what they did was they said, what is a vision for being quarantined and isolated in our house look like during the pandemic? They knew they needed to keep busy. They knew they needed to keep working on their fitness. How do you stay connected if you can't physically go out in the community anymore? And not only did they need to make sure Ben was healthy, mom and dad needed to stay healthy. Dad is a sheriff in the community, so they knew he was out in the community, and that was really scary for them as a family with their health. But they also knew there were things going on during the crisis that they didn't want to happen. They obviously didn't want anyone to get COVID. They didn't want Ben to be stressed and worried by all the news and all of the information that you'd be getting on social media. And so what they did above the line is they started to brainstorm and problem solve the things that they could remind themselves or family members or anyone hanging out with Ben that they could do during isolation. But they also knew the barriers and risks they needed to avoid. They knew that dad could be potentially exposed. They didn't, they knew that being cabin fever was a real thing. And so they started to, this was their snapshot and their reminder that they could hang on the refrigerator, and they could all kind of be reminded to work on those things during that time. So the trajectory, we use what we call life domains to help us start organizing and thinking more in depth around different areas. And where the life domains came from was oftentimes when we start planning and problem solving with people, we focus a lot on health and safety. And health and safety is very important to many of the individuals with disabilities that we know. It's really important to all of us, but sometimes it becomes the dominating topic. And sometimes we put so much focus on health and safety that a person's quality of life, their relationships, their opportunities for employment, their opportunities to live and be a part of their community are sometimes dampened by focusing so much on health and safety. So what we did was we said, okay, we need to really force ourselves to balance what we want to do around when we're problem solving. And so we know that these are all individual domains and ways that we can problem solve, but we also know they're very much interconnected, right? So I have to know about my job to know the type of house and the neighborhood I can live in. And do I want to live far or close to my job? What do I want to do during the day? So there's a lot of things about these life domains. So we have daily life and employment. So basically, what am I doing during the day? Community living, where do I live? How do I get around my community? Social and spirituality is often the last thing that's considered when we start planning with a person. And it really, quite frankly, should be the first thing we consider. Because if I sit down and I ask, 9 out of 10 people what their vision for a good life, family and friends is one of the first things that they talk about. But when we plan with a person with a disability, we don't intentionally plan around developing and maintaining friendships. And so how can we start doing that? And how can we start focusing on that? So these life domains become this sort of, I tell people, the Dewey Decimal System to remind us to think about all of the areas of life. It's going to be a little hard to read. Less important than what's exactly on this is to show you that we have a tool. We have a tool that this one is called Family Perspective Tool. And we also have this exact same tool that says Person-Centered Tool. The Person-Centered Tool is for the individual to fill out. It's what their vision for their good life looks like. This tool is for the family to fill out. And we've very intentionally have created 2 sets of all of our tools because we want families to have their voice valued and heard, but we also want to remind everybody it is their perspective. It may or may not be the same perspective of the individual. It may be the closest we can get to the perspective of the individual if they have a hard time communicating, but it still is not the perspective of that person. You can see from this that Ben's mom loves to fill this out. She wanted to provide as much detail as possible, and that for some people is overwhelming. For her, it was a way to start getting down the sort of ideas and hopes and fears and experiences that Ben has, so that if something happened to her, people would have an idea of what exactly is going on in his life. I've used this a number of different ways. I've sat down with families and I said, what is your biggest worry? When you lay your head down at night, what is it that you worry the most about? And they'll either say, well, I worry about what they're going to do during the day, or I worry about whether they're going to live. And I'll say, that's the only one we're going to talk about. And we can continue to work together to fill out other parts of our vision for the future. What you also see on the right-hand side of this form is the priority. And that's the thing, is that we can't do all of these things at one time. So what is the current highest priority? Some people number those. Some people say high, medium, low. And so it's a way for you to say, for Jane, it was, I got all of my information out there, but I understand I don't need to work on all of it right this second. What are our priorities in terms of things that we want to really be thinking about for Ben's future? So the fifth principle, though, is kind of taking all of these concepts and really, we use the phrase 3 buckets. And what you'll do is, you'll see in just a second, is we really believe that every individual, the person with a disability and or their family, they have 3 types of needs in order to really give them what they need to help create a good life. Oftentimes, we find that only one of those buckets is being filled, or one and not the other. And so what those 3 buckets are is that when we're problem solving and planning and navigating our life, whether we have a disability or not, we usually use these 3 buckets to do it. We usually have information to make a decision. So are we informed? Do we have the skills that we need? Do we have information to make an informed decision? Do we know how to navigate whatever it is that we want? And I can tell people, I could use this example for buying a new car. Do I have information about all of the cars? Do I understand one type of car over another type of car? Do I understand the different loans that might be available? So no matter what kind of decision we're making, we can use these 3 buckets. The second one is connecting with others who have been there, who understand. So do we have that sort of social support? Do we have friends and family? Do we have social capital? Do we have the self-efficacy, the confidence in ourselves to do it? Do we have our own sort of behavioral health needs? Are we depressed? And I tell a lot of professionals, you might go into a home and create these fantastic plans. However, if mom is too depressed to get out of bed, it doesn't matter how great your plans are, or all the things that you just laid out for them to do. So how are we addressing the social emotional needs of people? How can we ensure they have people in their lives? Are they connected to peer groups? Are they connected to people in their lives with and without disabilities? The third bucket is often the bucket that people jump to really, really fast to fill, and that's our goods and service bucket. And very much in the disability field, we've gotten into the habit of starting there. We show up for the talk to somebody about our loved one with a disability, and all of a sudden people want to either say, here's all the services that they can get. They don't necessarily know whether you're eligible or not, but they start talking about all these services. And so goods and services are very important to our day-to-day life, right? They help us with our physical support, our financial support. They help us with our material and instrumental needs. But we need to balance all 3 of those things and when we're making good, informed decisions. So this takes us to our 6th principle, which is focusing on integrated services and supports. So I'm going to give you a little bit background where this came from. And I actually think it was Connecticut that really pushed us to make it into a star. And so a long time ago, we were like, okay, so, people use the phrase natural supports a lot in our field. And we spent the first couple of years saying, what does natural supports mean? Like, what does it really, truly mean? And if you think about it, the disability field is one of the only fields that uses the phrase natural support. If you really try to start Googling natural support, you get natural resources, you get all these other things. And so when you start thinking about natural supports, We've used it in our field because we were an institutional service system. And we started to say, formal supports are institutional supports. We want people to have those natural supports. And so we started to use that phrase a lot. You know, you fast forward to the 2000s, and I hear that phrase used all the time. And what's starting to happen is sometimes if people have natural supports, they might not be eligible for services. So the phrase natural supports has many connotations. So we wanted to dig into that and really understand what it means. I always like to tell people, my mama used to always say, you know, so we called and asked for help, and they'd say, well, why don't you tap into your natural supports? And she said, that was such a slap in my face, because I wouldn't be calling asking for supports if I had all the natural supports in my life. So what we started to do is we started to ask people, what does natural supports mean for you? And some people, half the room would say, it's the people in my life, my relationships. The other half of the people would say, well, natural supports, like those are things anybody in the community could access, you know, going to the library, you know, doing, you know, getting a job in the community. And so we said, okay, well, why don't we just start using those words instead? And so we said, okay, we have relationship supports, we've got community-based supports, and then we have eligibility-based supports. And what eligibility-based supports means is those are all of our paid sort of government supports. We quickly realized that probably, you know, we're all using technology right now. Many of you probably have a cell phone. So why, when we start talking about supports, do we not talk about technology-based supports? And so we began that circle and started to say, when you start planning with someone, use all 4 parts of the supports. What we quickly, after the first year, started to realize is that many times we leave out that person's personal strengths, their resources, their skills, their abilities. And so it evolved into now what is called the integrated support star. And in Connecticut, I've actually seen some of your training. You talk about the 5, you know, if your 5 fingers, and when you're planning with somebody, and I tell people I could do this whether I'm planning for disability services or I'm planning for what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. I think about my personal strengths, right? Can I cook? Can I, maybe I can't. I need to tap into my relationship-based support. So can somebody in my house cook? Luckily, my husband's a fantastic cook. If I'm not tapping into that for dinner, are we going somewhere in their community? We're going out to a restaurant. Or am I using technology? Am I using Uber Eats, or I'm calling in for a pizza? So we problem solve all the time. So what the star has really become is what's called a problem solving star. And I tell people you can use it for lots of different things, but you can especially use it when you're starting to think about planning for a person with a disability, because you're thinking about what are the eligibility-based supports? Who are the people in their lives for relationships? What are the strengths they're bringing to the table? What technologies might help them? Not just adaptive equipment, but technologies that can help them. And what are things in the community that we should be tapping into? I tell people that it's really important to think about all 5 points of the star, because if I only focus on one part of that star, if I'm the type of person that says, you know, I'd love for my loved one to live in a group home, I want them to have all paid services, maybe they're involved in Special Olympics, maybe they, you know, work in some sort of employment that's only with people with disabilities. To me, that was what I would call an all green life. That is someone who hasn't diversified their services and supports and their relationships. They're not tapping into their friends and families. They don't have strong roles in their community. And so how do we really help that individual and that family start adding more colors in terms of the types of services and supports that they're thinking about? But the other part can be true too. Remember that slide where I said there's 75% of people that may not have paid services in your state? Well, those people are reliant on moms and dads and relatives and neighbors. And those people too are only using one part of that support star. And we know that people that are using only one part of that support star is there's a lot of burnout, there's a lot of bridges burnt, there's a lot of social isolation. And so how do we help that individual tap into the other colors of the star as well? So from a visual standpoint, what is it we're trying to do? We're trying to figure out those 5 integrated supports for every decision and every services and supports for that individual so that they can lead to the trajectory that they want to lead to. So we can use the star in many, many different ways. This is my little brother's star. We used it as a family when we were problem solving before going to one of his his annual planning meetings. And we used it because we felt like even though there were people in his life, his relationships was something that was so important to us to help have his staff help maintain and help him build new friendships and new roles in the community. And so for us, we used it sort of map that out and said, yes, he has a girlfriend, but how can we make sure he continues to call her and see her? Yes, he has family, but are you helping him FaceTime with them? Are you helping him show up with a birthday present at a birthday party? We got him an iPad. He has a smartphone now. We taught him how to use it. There's places he loves to go in the community. So could we go with him? Can we meet him there? And he does have a companion. He has a 24-hour paid companion that they live in a house together. So how are we tapping into that and utilizing every part of that star when we think about it? We did the same exercise with Ben. We did it when Ben's twin brother went off to college, and mom and dad didn't really actually ever think about the amount of supports that Ben's twin brother Matt provided, because mom and dad would get up and go to work, and Matt and Ben would get ready for school, and they'd get on the bus together. Well, now all of a sudden Matt's gone off to college, and mom and dad can't just get dressed and leave anymore. There were other things they hadn't thought about in many, many years of really thinking about Ben's supports. And so when we sat down and we mapped out his current services, we started to think about his paid services. And then I said, who are the other people who support him? And it was mom and dad. So we took those 2 colors and we put them on what a typical week looks like. And what we saw there is he was using his self-directed services that could be used a lot of different ways. He was using them from a typical 8 to 5 day. And what they also realized is, wow, if something happened to mom and dad, he'd either need more paid services or he'd have nobody. And so the other thing it made them realize is that Ben was 20. What 20-year-old wants to hang out with their mom and dad all of the time? And so it started to help them start planning and thinking very differently. And it grew. It did not happen overnight. What started to happen was this is what it currently looks like. We started to think very differently about his self-directed services and said, we could use these differently. He already volunteers at the fire station. Does he have to have his paid staff with them? And we talked to the firemen and the fire chief, and they said, no, we don't need paid staff here. And so now he could be dropped off in the morning, and that freed up 3 hours of paid services they could use on a Saturday to go to the movies with friends or do something very different. What they also started to realize is, going back to life experiences and dignity of risk, is that because Ben always had oversight, he had never been alone for even 5 minutes by himself. And not that they ever wanted to leave him alone for 5 minutes, but what if a staff didn't show up and he was an adult? Would he know what to do? Would he panic? Would he know how to call somebody? And so mom started to actually start walking for her own health's sake. And she used to walk from her front door to the sign. And she'd say, Ben, I'm going right there and back. You're going to be okay. And it started out being 5 minutes, and then it was 10 minutes. And then they realized if they got him an iPad, he could FaceTime with mom while she was walking and check in. Then he realized he really wanted a dog. So they got a dog, and they started to teach him, like, When do you answer the door? When don't you answer the door? And it started to be the stepping stones that they hope one day they can use some forms of remote supports, because Ben's gotten used to and comfortable with using a phone or technology to realize he's not alone. There is people there to support him. They just might not be in that room, or they might not be inside that house just yet. So there was a lot of different things that we did to really start building integrated supports for Ben. This is Ben's safety and security star. So that is a big issue for Ben, for a couple different reasons. Ben's family is adamant that he will never have a guardian in the state of Missouri. They wanted to use every form of alternatives to guardianship as possible, and they wanted to really use supported decision making. And so we have on the right-hand side, it's not showing up on the screen very well, but we have what I call starter stars, and those stars are different ideas based on different topics. So for this one, it's that starter star on a website is around alternatives to guardianship. What we did with a blank star is we started to say, in order for Ben to be safe, whether he had a guardian or not, he needed all parts of the star to work together. We needed to work on some things now. We needed to help him start using his iPad, his digital watch. Did he use online banking? Did he have a joint bank account? Was there someone in his family he could have a joint bank account with if you were worried about his finances? Could we set up automatic bill pay and direct deposits, because that would help with finances? But we also started to say, does he carry his wallet? Does he know how to use his debit? Can he call 911? And so they started to work on these things to put sort of protections in a lot of different ways to not only protect his safety, his decision making, and his personal safety as well. And so we use that star over a series of a couple years and continue to add to that star to really look at what are the things that mom and dad can feel a little more confident that Ben will either know how to be safe, or there's other sort of safeguards in place in his life. This is something that they did. They used the star to develop a new routine. So they used the star to problem solve when COVID happened. So they started to say, well, what are we going to put in place to develop a new routine? Do we use visual schedules? Can we use prompts on our smartphone? How do we build Ben's new interests using technology? Can we schedule calls with friends and family, do Zoom calls? Are there virtual activities that we can start doing? And so that star during COVID was another way to really problem solve and think through things. Our last principle, I think it's important. Sometimes I tell people, sometimes I actually think I should start with this principle, is that everything about a person's life should be driven by that person. It should be supported by that family or driven by that person and that family. And that includes not only our own services, but it includes, are you helping to drive the change in your state? Are you advocating with the programs that have services? Are you advocating for the laws and the statewide services that are being offered? And are they listening? Are they building systems that people really want? Are they building systems they think people want? So you've got to be at the table to really engage, lead, and drive policy change. And it's really important for the framework to be integrated like that. And with that voice, how do we change across the entire lifespan? So maybe things are going really well in early childhood, but now all of a sudden you're in school and school isn't going well. Or you graduate from school and now you're in the adult service systems. And oftentimes people feel like they've hit a cliff, or they're standing on a cliff. So how can we, when we work on policy change and advocacy, how can we make sure we're doing it across the entire lifespan? Not only disability specific policies, but how are we changing all policies so they're inclusive of all people? And so we know that transformation has to occur at all levels. We know it has to occur with the individual, families, professionals, organizational leaders, systems change agents, and community members. So you can use the LifeCourse tools at all levels to do those things, whatever area you're getting ready to change. So real quick overview. We're focusing on the person within the context of their family. We're thinking about that person across all of the life domains, recognizing that they're individual outcome areas, but they're all interconnected. We know to support that person and their families, we need to think about the 3 buckets of support. What's their informational and skill needs? What are the connecting and networking needs? And what are the goods and services that they need? But we also know that we have to be providing integrated supports when we're thinking about this and problem solving. So are we using all 5 parts of that star when we're thinking about solutions? Are we creating a trajectory towards what a person wants? And are we doing that across their entire lifespan? So that sort of summarizes the entire framework for you right there. On our website are different tools. They're all free and available to you to use. We're putting more and more on there, how-to videos, little snippets, other people's examples for using those. But there's a lot of people in Connecticut themselves that are very comfortable and are using LifeCourse in a lot of different areas with transition, for service planning, in a lot of different ways as well. This PowerPoint will be available to you. My contact information is on there. And I'm always open to emails or phone calls with ideas or stories or things that challenged you or you didn't agree with or things you have more questions about. So with that, I'm going to pause, take this off the screen, and I'm going to see if there's any chats, but I'm also going to open it up to any thoughts or reflections or questions that you might have.
Please type any questions into the chat box. There were several, and while we're waiting for that, let me just, first of all, thank you, Sheli. That was a wonderful way to kick off our webinar series on building a great life. I can't think of a better way to start. So thank you very much for that. And I'm really excited that you all will have access to those materials. There are some materials posted on our website. Please go there and look for those. There were a couple of comments in the chat box about housing. I do want you to know that in August, we're actually offering 2 webinars on housing, one on sort of the national perspective and one on the state perspective and housing rights. So we will be focusing a lot on housing. Supported decision making will be in September. We'll be doing 2 sessions on employment. So, please look at the entire calendar and mark your calendars for March 4th. That's our next webinar from 6 to 7:30 on March 4th. And it will be following up on this with a panel discussion on dignity of risk and a discussion by some advocates and some family members on ways that they have addressed this within their own lives. So we look forward to a great follow-up to this framework that's been so well presented today.
Yeah, and I want to address the creative housing concept, and I think that it's you're right on in your comment about how can you use the star to kind of think very differently. And one of the things that really resonated for our family was we had gone the traditional route. We had tried many different settings for my little brother. He lived in a group home. He lived in an ISL. He lived in a more of a congregate setting, and none of them really worked for us. And I just remember, we're a family that strongly believes in community and believes in integration. And we were just really, really struggling to get him happy where he wasn't really communicating with all of the behaviors that he was communicating with, and really felt like we were at a crossroads. And and I think that our system leads families to believe that it's like this all or nothing option. And when we started to learn more about the fact that where you live doesn't have to be tied to your services, and that Eric could receive in our state, it's the shared living model or the companion model, and it was brand new to our state, and it was available, but nobody knew about it. Nobody knew how to do it. Families didn't really trust it. And I remember my dad saying, wow, so you're saying that we can find a home for Eric to live in that's his room, his environment, that makes sense to his needs, and that we can hire an agency, and instead of the agency firing us and kicking us out of their group home or ISL or whatever, quite frankly, we can kick the provider agency out and get a new one or get new staff. And that distinction of really understanding that housing is really doesn't have to be tied to the services really changed everything for us and for Eric, and how we started to plan very differently for him. In different states, there are other limitations. It's not always that easy. There are all things that kind of tie those two things together. But that when you start thinking about housing, it doesn't have to be only what's available in terms of what's residentially provided by your service providers. And I think that gives people a lot of control, and it really changes the power dynamic, so to speak, in terms of creating a great life. Are there any other questions or thoughts or reflections? Did it resonate with you? Was there something? I always like to ask people, you know, and we can unmute if you want. You could probably unmute, or I can ask you to unmute if you put your hand up or whatever. There's those little reactions on the bottom. But, you know, was there something that resonated with you? I always say, is there an aha? Did something validate something you already thought, or challenge something? Didn't know if anybody wanted to share anything with us. You can write it in the chat, or you can wave and I can unmute your phone. Or Jamie
has his hand up.
Susan, I'll get you in a second. So Jamie, you'll have to unmute.
Can he unmute?
Yep.
Okay.
I had two things. When you were talking about you know, dignity and rest, and when you were talking about you know, the all means all. We have a quote in the self-advocacy world: nothing about us without us. Or
Yes.
if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
That's right.
And the second question, the other question I had was, today we did our IP meeting and we used the LifeCourse, and then my case manager were asking me, oh, how much you get paid? How we need 3 month average of that, 3 month average of your Social Security, and 3 month average of your rent subsidy. I'm thinking, why does the state need this information? I pay my own bills. I you know, keep track of my own money. And the case manager was like, well, whoever wrote the, you know, whoever wrote this packet is the one who's asking those questions. So I mean, that's a you know, answer. It's not what I was looking for, but it's, you know, an answer. So it just occurred to me that it's like, why do they need, you know, that's why I kept all my receipts for a long time, because you just never know if
Right. Yeah.
audit you or whatever, you know.
So what you're pointing out is so in a way, it's really great that the state agency decided to incorporate LifeCourse into their planning process, but they're also incorporating some of their requirements into that same process as well. And so some of that, you know, giving you're talking about budgets and that kind of stuff, are some of their eligibility requirements. And so LifeCourse is more of that sort of life coaching planning stuff, but they've incorporated it into their service conversation. So, oh, I was just going to ask Susan to unmute, and she just popped off the screen. Anybody else have any aha moments they'd like to share before we get off? Mandy? Are you able to
Hi.
unmute?
I do have a question.
Okay.
How do I support myself and my cousin with autism? And how do we deal with how do we make our own support? How do we make our own support plan and make it into a visual chart or some sort? We live in Vermont.
So my email was on that slide, and it probably is going to be on an email that's sent out after this. If you want to email me, I'll get you connected to somebody either in Vermont, or I'll have somebody in Missouri kind of walk you through that.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
great.
Shelley, can I just interrupt for 1 second with two things?
Absolutely.
Thank you. One is that I found my data for when I was becoming a LifeCourse ambassador. And when it comes to services from our Department of Developmental Services, 84% of people with intellectual disabilities in the state of Connecticut do not receive services. So if we're talking about the all, 16% are absorbing all of those state dollars. So what you're saying about distributing services and relying more on community and relationships and assistive technology, et cetera, is so important for that reason. The other thing I wanted to say is if anybody here is from People First of Connecticut and would like to stay on a little bit afterward, we can kind of debrief some of the information that Shelley talked about if you would like. So just don't hang up and we'll talk to you then. I'll be quiet again.
Yeah, well, if nobody else has any other reflections, I'd love to hear things, email, like I said, email or call, check out the website, check out the Facebook page. There's a closed group that's only closed that you just have to go in and say you want to join it. It's called, I always forget it. I think it's LifeCourse in Action or something. A lot of people just like you are using it or just learned about the framework, and it's just a place that you can ask questions or do different things as well. So we're really trying the LifeCourse in Action. Thank you, Mindy. So the thing that's the most important to me is that it's accessible to people, which is why it's online. And we're really here just to help people learn about it and help you figure out how to apply it and how it can help you in your own lives. So there are things about it that aren't necessarily right or wrong. There are things for you just to try. And if it's helpful for you, you keep doing it. If it's not helpful, there's probably another solution out there. But I always tell people, if you go to any of our LifeCourse sessions that we host or anybody else hosts, you're a part of a larger community. You're a part of a community of people that really are using the framework to how do we create great lives for all people, and how do we work together to really learn about how do we implement this in practice? How do we help voc rehab counselors? How do we teach special educators about it? And so we don't have all the answers. People just like you are people we partner with. So I appreciate your time and spending your evening with us, and hope this was helpful. Gretchen, do you have a question? Oh, I have to ask you to unmute. Hold on a second. Are you able to unmute?
Such control.
I know, it's weird.
So this was a great presentation, and you have an amazing family that they would devote that kind of time to make sure that you're addressing everything. And I'm sure that that's influenced you and you've influenced them. But what do you say to the families who basically are shut off and they say, well, my child, whatever loved one can't do this. They won't be able to do it. There's no way. They're not going to be safe. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the word safe and I can't.
Yes.
And we've talked about it in the context of assistive technology. And Molly and I actually were going to go on strike in a group we were in because I wanted to call it something about safe at home or something like that. But
it was terrible.
So supported decision making is something that Molly and I are also, and Linda, are working on. And you know, I can see where this would be great if you could start families very early to do this. But how do you convince families now who are in that, my child's getting, you know, is 18 or is getting to 18 and I'm running for guardianship and Social Security?
You know, it's really hard, right? Because it's personal and it's emotional, and, you know, you understand their fear, right? Because it's really their fear that you're having to plan for. And I think oftentimes we plan around the person as opposed to planning who really carries the fear and it's creating the barrier. And it's typically somebody around that person. And I will tell you, using Ben as an example, Jane was always like, he could never be home by himself. And we had to start very, very small. And I think sometimes the stuff in our field is very abrupt. You know, I tell a mom and dad, so if you get hit tomorrow by a bus, they're going to go from total overprotection to gone. So you're doing them no good by not teaching them little baby steps. What are little tiny things you can do? And it's about getting, unfortunately, mom and dad comfortable with it, right? It's about you know, I worked with a bunch of a bunch of individuals that were working on transition and employment. We had all their employment all figured out. The person was really excited about this new job, and mom and dad walked in and they're like, no, that's not safe. They're not doing that, right? So we didn't plan with mom and dad to address their fears that are real, right? I understand those fears are real, but it's like, and I think it's about taking baby steps. You know, Jane's husband was very reluctant about trying any of this stuff. He was like, are you kidding me? We're not leaving Ben home for 5 minutes. But then after they did it for a year, all of a sudden Jane needed to be at a meeting, and the dad was running late, and Ben was at home while they were crisscrossing on the highway. And he was like, okay, that worked. I never would have tried it had I not tried the, you know, just walking to the stop sign and back. And so what are those itty bitty things that you can start doing? My dad swore up and down that Eric should never and could never use a cell phone. So what did me and my siblings do? We bought him one for Christmas. And all of a sudden my dad was like, ugh. And now my dad thinks it's the greatest thing ever because Eric doesn't live at home and he can hit my dad's picture at any given time and say hi. And it's changed the whole dynamic of that thing. So what are those tiny itty bitty things when those families are saying no? You just like, what's that little thing? And those successes will hopefully grow. I know that's not the answer, but sometimes that's what you have to do.
I think that's what we espouse, you know, and we're working on a supported decision-making booklet, and we're like, start early and start making choices. And the more you make, the more. So I think we're right on board with that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This has been just spectacular. I did put a link in the chat box for an evaluation. Please click on the link and fill out the evaluation. We will also be sending it to emails after this session ends. I want to again thank Sheli, and it's just been a great evening. And I want to thank each of you for spending time with us. So yes, applause. Yes, thank you.
Yes,
Thank you very
thank you
much.
guys. It was so nice seeing your faces. Have a great evening.